The Fraternitas Saturni, History, Doctrine, and Rituals of the Magical Order of the Brotherhood of Saturn, by Stephen E. Flowers, Ph.D. Chapter 1. A History of the Fraternitas Saturni. Distant Roots. As with all organizations of an occult nature, accurate and consistent historical data for the FS are hard to obtain. For some aspects, there is an abundance of information, while in other areas we are left to speculate. In this chapter, I want to trace the history of the SS as an organization and as an idea, and at the same time remain as much as possible within the context of events in the contemporary occult subculture. Documents within the FS point to the idea that on some mystical level there is a connection between the ancient mysteries of the Germanic past and the Fraternitas Saturni. It is held that there were Saturnian brotherhoods working as early as the end of the 1600s in Sweden, Denmark, and Poland. Also, it is indicated that there is a mystical connection between the Greco-Roman Saturnian principle, Latin fatum or fate, and the Old Germanic high god Wotan, whose name is also spelled in these documents as Photon, hence the link with fatum. Supposedly, both Joseph Maria Hoene Wronski in the 19th century and Gregor A. Gregorius in the 20th century made these connections. This photon is seen as the all-ruling principle of fate, which does not itself succumb to the ultimate twilight of the gods. It is understandable in light of the neo-romantic Germanticism so prevalent in late 19th and early 20th Germany that the FS doctrine would to some extent derive from the Germanic, or as they would have it, Aryan, north, rather than from the Mediterranean regions. Later it was emphasized that the Brotherhood had its origins in the rituals of the Roman Saturnalia, which takes place around December 27th, which made clear the FS's tendency away from the Christian worldview and toward a more pagan and even darker philosophy. At one point, apparently sometime between 1927 and 1933, there was a provision of the group that only Christians, i.e. non-Jews, could be initiated and that all neophytes had to acknowledge the basic Nordic ideology of the lodge. This aspect was obviously ignored after the reform of the FS in the post-World War II era. This dimension is brought up to indicate the underlying belief that the FS had its mystical origins in the north, and that there was indeed an early Saturnian brotherhood in the Scandinavian region whose history remains quite obscure. It was to these dim roots that the early FS traced its mystic origins. As far as the earlier Scandinavian Brotherhood of Saturn that was supposed to have been working during the late 17th and early 18th centuries is concerned, it is only said that it was active in alchemy and mathematical and Pythagorean mysticism, and that this group was probably based on an even earlier brotherhood in the region. By the end of the 18th century, those lodges disappeared and nothing further seems to have been heard of them. According to FS documents, a Saturnian brotherhood was revived in Warsaw by the mathematician and mystic Joseph Maria Hoene Wronski, 1776 to 1853. This lodge was said to have outer courts in Krakow, Posen, and Thorn. Ultimately, these lodges were destroyed due to the effects of various wars in the region. Although the mysterious Hoene Wronski may have indeed revived a Saturnian lodge in Poland, the historical record makes it clear that he could not have remained active there, because by the time he was 21, he was already studying philosophy in Germany. Wronski spent most of his life as a Polish expatriate in France, where he is generally held to have been the magical initiator of Alphonse Louis Constant, or, as he was better known, Eliphi Levi. Wronski indeed seems to have been an occult master involved with the ideas of the Kabbalah, Gnosticism, and the teachings of Jacob Boehme. But he was also a well-respected, if somewhat eccentric, mathematician and philosopher of his day. He was also dedicated to romantic social reform movements and was the leader of the group called the Antimonian Union. Among other things, Wronski held that humanity was to pass through 5 evolutionary stages and that his theories would open the way to the 5th and final stage. Perhaps the most important of Wronski's theories was his principle of the absolute, which held that knowledge of truth was possible through human reason combined with a secret mathematical formula. However, he never seems to have been able to communicate this formula. Related to this was his law of creation, which posited that man could create reality from the sum of his sense impressions, again combined with a mathematical formula. The historical connections between Wronski and the FS are tenuous, but there are several points where his theories and legacy touch upon the later development of the FS itself. Not the least of these is certainly his role as the initiator of Levi between the years of 1850 and 1853, who was to be instrumental in the general occult revival of the late 19th century. Rebirth. Before we can fully understand the founding and subsequent development of the present FS from 1928, a more complete context for the magical revival in the late 19th and earlier 20th century Germany needs to be outlined. The German-speaking region of Central Europe was itself the breeding ground of certain hidden streams of occultism, but these were often so deep underground that they did not call much public attention to themselves. The roots of much of this activity in German-speaking Europe can be traced to the Rosicrucians and the Bavarian Illuminati. Some of these currents were taken up by individuals and groups outside the region, especially in England, where we note the German roots of such organizations as the Golden Dawn and the Ordo Templi Orientis, and subsequently reimported into the German-speaking world in a more popularized form. The popular occult revival came somewhat later to Germany than it did to France and England, but once it did arrive, it struck deeper roots there than it had elsewhere. This might be due to the long-standing subcultural presence of occultism already mentioned. The most important single stream of the early magical revival in Germany and Austria for the history of the FS is that of the quasi-masonry, or the Winkelmauerei, as it's called in German. These are irregular lodges with no legitimate connection to Masonry, but which are built upon Masonic principles of ritual and organization. Various Masonic and quasi-Masonic lodges had been active in Germany from at least the 18th century. Many of them were highly secretive because of their political activities or due to their own fears of political suppression. Here we will only be concerned with those groups known to have done magical work and to have some connection with the eruption of occult activity in Central Europe between the world wars. An often neglected part of the prehistory and early history of the Fraternitas Saturni is the role played by Adonism. A general outline of Adonism is provided in Appendix K. This school of magical and religious thought was largely the invention of a brilliant Venetian scholar, Franz Sattler, who unusually wrote about the pseudonym Dr. Musalem. Sattler compiled a German-Persian conversation dictionary and numerous works on language instruction in his academic work, and he also published a 5-volume travelogue of his sojourns in the East. But in his esoteric endeavors, he was responsible for the construction of a complete magical system based on a peculiar neo-pagan pantheon, at the head of which stood Adonis. Musalem equated Adonis with Satan or the devil and took a markedly anti-Christian stance. The primary mode of worshiping Adonis was through sexual enjoyment, both heterosexual and homosexual. He overtly stated that Adonism is the worship of the devil by means of erotic activity. Dr. Musalem formed the Adonistische Gesellschaft in Vienna. This organization was active between 1925 and 1931 and published numerous written works, including a journal called Dido and an almanac called Adonis. Although the organization had definite aims and methods, it did not require any vows or restrictions. This is because the whole purpose of the movement was to be the liberation of humanity from inhibitions and limitations of all kinds. It was a libertine philosophy coupled with magical ideology. According to Musalem Sattler, this ideology was retrieved to him by the Bit El Nur, House of Light, a sort of monastery situated in the semi-mythical land of Nuristan. Nuristan is supposedly in present-day Afghanistan. There, a high priest called the Shakim Hachkimin, or the Wise of the Wise, ruled over a college of priests and maintained a temple with a marvelous museum and library that was vaster and more complex than anything found elsewhere in the world. Musalem would have us to believe that he spent several years in this facility and returned to Europe to disseminate occult knowledge to help usher in the new Golden Age, which was to have its inception around the year 2000. This age of world salvation was to be symbolized by the serpent and characterized by the qualities of freedom and truth. The onanistic wisdom of the East was drawn from many cultures, but there seems to be a special affinity for the Kurdish Yezdis. Another active member of Dr. Musallam's group was Friedrich Wilhelm Quentscher. Quentscher and Sattler, who maintained their headquarters in Vienna at the time, had a falling out over a love triangle with another member of the group, Madame Ariella. In 1929, Quentscher, who often wrote under the name Ra Omir, also formed his own Adonistic group, the Auschwitz Taganisian, also known as the Adonistic League. He began to issue his own works out of his own publishing house and printing press. These included the Dienrich Schriften, Generic Writings, Volume 1, 1928, and a journal called Erdbruderschaft, or Earth Brotherhood, of which there were 3 issues by 1932. A student of Quentscher is said to have been the Czech German author and stage musician Franz Bardon. Bardon was from the Sicilian town of Troppo or Opava, and he worked as a stage musician from the mid-1920s under the name Forbato. He came into contact with Quentscher and by all accounts became a member of his Adonistic circle. There he was known as Master Orion. In June of 1941, he was arrested and placed in a concentration camp in Breslau, and then transferred to Troppau and released in October of that same year. For the rest of his life, he worked as a healing practitioner in Munich and in Opava. Well after the war, he ran afoul of the communist Czech authorities due to his claims of being able to cure cancer. He was arrested and died in custody in 1958. The occult novel Forbato is a supposedly veiled autobiography of Bardon, ascribed to his own authorship, although it was perhaps written by his secretary. One of the most important of these shadowy lodges, and certainly the most diabolically mysterious, was the Freemasonic Order of the Golden Centurion. This order was supposedly founded in 1840 in Munich by a group of rich German industrialists and well-placed citizens. The FOGC was an openly demonological order that maintained magical contact with the tetrad of demons, Barzabal, Astaroth, Belial, and Asmodeus. The service of these entities was to provide the initiates of the order with untold personal power, influence, and wealth. The main avenues for our knowledge about the existence of the FOGC comes from certain members of the FS and from the writings of the Adonist Wilhelm Quentscher and Franz Bardon. Both certainly wrote about it in a negative light, but Quentscher also left traces in his writings that give the impression he was somehow connected with the FOGC. For example, the designation of his investigational association was the OCFG, which seems to be a rearrangement of the letters of the order in question. In essence, the FOGC can be seen as a cult of human sacrifice. This would have been sacrifice of a Middle Eastern or Semitic type and not of the Indo-European kind. The term centurium in the order's name is Latin for a group or division of 100. Actually, the number of initiates in the lodge was limited to 99. The 100th member of the order was the daemonium itself. The whole affair was taken care of annually on the night of June 23rd, St. John's Day. On that night, the lodge members would convene, and if no brother had died in the course of the previous year, a lodge sacrifice had to be chosen. This was done by drawing lots. The initiate chosen for this honor would then drink a poison draught in order to complete the sacrificial act. In the case of his refusal, this would be accomplished at a distance by means of dreaded typophony, a machine which, when coupled with the will of a magician, could kill a person no matter where they were. This machine is also mentioned and described in some FS documents. The sinister FOGC plays a dominant role in the magical autobiography of Franz Bardon, Forbato, wherein dramatic instances of the application of the tepophone are portrayed. Most of the material having to do with the FOGC seems quite legendary and fantastic in tone, but certain features of it are more practically treated in some FS archival materials. An initiation ritual of the FOGC derived from this material is provided in Appendix 1. The reader can compare it to the rituals of the FS proper.